develops and manages oral history projects, and creates personal histories on audio, video, and in print. Elisabeth's work is wide-ranging and includes interviewing and interpretation for survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, the September 11, 2001 Narrative and Memory Project at Columbia, and in addition, Elisabeth has taught workshops for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress and the Mixed Heritage Oral History Project at the Brooklyn Historical Society. She is currently a consultant at large to the Henry Nouwen Oral History Project at the Henry Nouwen Institute in Toronto, Canada. Elisabeth has worked extensively in Europe, and she's going to talk about her beginnings. But she was the regional project director in the United States and Canada for the Mauthausen Survivors Documentation Project at the University of Vienna. She speaks many languages, including English, German, Italian, and understands French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Yiddish. On her website, she very generously acknowledges the expert colleagues and associates that she works with, and we are thrilled that she is one of ours here. Some of her great resources on her website just span from books to authors to some reviews to organizations, and they run from storytelling programs at St. John the Divine here to books such as The Unauthorized Biography of the World, Oral History on the Front Lines by Michael Reardon, which was very fun to read, and organizations such as the International Coalition of Historic Sites of Conscience. So Elisabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you for this lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And I first thank you for inviting me. It's exciting and wonderful to be here. I love it. And thank you for listening to me. To those who have just arrived, I'm sorry, I have a cold and my voice is not my best voice, so please bear with me. I'll try to keep it. What I would like to share with you is really this journey of an interviewer, and I thought that since you are all involved in oral history, I will need to embed it, as I would in an interview, at least in part, into my own life history, to show you why I'm doing the things that I'm doing and why my journey is the way as it is and has been. And also, I want to emphasize that I really consider myself most of all an interviewer, because interviewing is that what I think I really do best, and where I mean, that's something that I thought a lot as I was listening to all of you who are now in this master's program, and you are on this journey thinking, what am I going to do next, and how will I integrate that, what I've learned, into the actual life out there? Will it be academia? Will I get employed somewhere in a historic society or in some organization and work for them? Will I be independent? Will I do something entirely different? Each of you, probably according to your talents and to your experience, and also to that what unfortunately the circumstances of our not very easy economy and life situation will allow, you will find your way. But what I think that I would like to show you with telling my story is that even if you think you are totally stuck, or even if you think that you start at a beginning that is entirely different from that what you are achieving, or if you feel there's one barrier after the next and then you try to work your way around the barrier, whatever you will be doing, if you can identify here in your solar plexus this one thing that you want to do in your life, or the kind of activity where you know that as I always call it, your soul starts flying. If you succeed to get to that point, then all the rest will fall in place. And then also all the dead-end roads that you will have to walk are part of the story, and you will learn from them, and they will catapult you, strangely enough, especially the dead ends, will catapult you into the next chapter, while keeping somehow in an open-minded way the vision of what you want to do. And for me, this is my vision, or that's what I really love to do. As I said, I'm not a scholar, I'm not really a researcher, I do my observations. I feel like a complete fraud in here, or an imposter, if I tell you I haven't even finished high school, and I will tell you why. So, but all that at the end doesn't matter. I have a stepson who is severely dyslexic, and there where he had to go to school to overcome his dyslexia, you have, each house has the name of a famous person, Edison and Einstein and so forth. They all were also total school failures. So am I. I'm not putting myself really, definitely not, into any of that level of these people. But that's what, when I saw that in my stepson, what encouraged me also to think, okay, even if you don't finish high school, you can walk your way. And I tell you how it went. I was born in *51. It's not a secret. I'm 60 years old. I'm a lady of a certain age by now, and I enjoy it. And I was born in Linz, which is a tiny little, not tiny actually. It was in the States it would be a tiny. It's a town of 200,000 inhabitants, and it happened to be a town that used to be a very rural center of commerce, and then in the 30s, because as history so does it, not far from there Adolf Hitler was born. He wanted to make this into a center of industry, and he did. And he wanted to make it into one of his three main of the main centers of the Third Reich: Berlin, Munich, Linz in Austria, in his hometown. And I grew up in the 50s, as I have a brother who is younger, who also didn't finish high school, so there must be some reason why that is. As the daughter of my father Erich, who had returned in '45 from being incarcerated 6 years by Hitler after having been put on trial, because he was one of the few who resisted. He had a resistance group, and in '39 the resistance group was betrayed, and he was put on trial with the rest of the group, was condemned to death, and then because of circumstances that are maybe too long now to explain and to describe, my grandmother, whose only son he was, succeeded to approach a high-ranking person in Berlin who wrote a letter to the court, and since he wrote the letter to the court saying that the entire family was fabulous Aryan, no Jewish blood anywhere, and somehow this guy was the only black sheep in the family. So since they wrote that letter, the court knew that they couldn't. Only later, when I did research in the archives, my beloved grandmother not only saved her only son, but she saved also the others, because since the head wasn't being executed, also the others were not executed. So they were all in prison until '45. And so to have been for 6 years in prison, even coming back as somebody who came back and knew that he had done the right thing. But 6 years of this kind of horror that you undergo, that leave scars. And I grew up under the shadow of having a father who was brilliant. He had two postgraduate degrees. He was on his way to be a diplomat. That's also how he then was why he was so politically interested and became the head of the resistance group. He came back in 1945 to an Austria. That was the reason why he went to prison. He wanted to keep his country free. But to an Austria that was very, very changed. And also in this tiny town, he knew that there were very, very few, a handful of people who had, before the war or during the Nazi occupation, similar views like him. 99% of the people had been Nazis. So imagine now my family in this kind of bubble, because also my mother had come from a family of resistance. Her own father was the first political prisoner, non-Jewish, who was beaten to death in Dachau. So she and her 5 siblings had lost their father when she was a teenager. And so there was this little family in Linz, and surrounded by, and yeah, what I was surrounded by is something that I'm and there our memory and issues that we talked about before come really into play, is that I construct certainly my history, and I construct what I remember. What I remember is obviously or very clearly to me a mixture of that what I actually experienced in school. I mean, I know that I was with the back against the wall when I stood up and asked about certain historic events that were totally clear to me, but still were not appropriate to talk about in the 50s and in the 60s in Austria. Or I clearly remember that when I would quote something from everyday politics that I had read in the newspaper, that then in the break people from my class would come to me and say, "How do you know this?" And I would say, "Well, it must have been 12 years old." And I said, "Well, I read it this morning with my father in the newspaper." And they all looked at me as if I came from the moon and said, "What? You are allowed to read the newspaper?" So imagine this strange environment where at home I have a father who had been on the right side, and it was obvious that he had been on the side of those who were not the perpetrators, and who taught us children. And that's one of the reasons why probably we failed in school, or that's one of my interpretations why we failed in school. He told us, always ask questions. Ask questions, never take that what is being told to you, be it in the newspaper, be it on the radio, be it by an authority, be it by a teacher. Don't take A for an A, always try to go behind and figure out for yourself if that what they tell you is really true. So I can imagine, I don't remember it, but I can imagine that with this kind of attitude, probably I must have been a real pest to my teachers. Because if you constantly question things that are being presented, and post-war Austria was still full of rules and full of the attitudes that still revibrated from the Third Reich. So, to make the long story short, when I was, I think, 17, and that was the rigidity of the system, I stopped going to school. Because in Austria at the time, if you went to school and you failed in one subject at the end of the year, you had an opportunity to do another work for the entire summer, then make a test, and then you either failed or you didn't fail, and if you failed, you had to go back and repeat the entire year again. So that happened to me 3 times, and when it happened for the 3rd time, I was told it's over. You cannot continue your education. It's over. Not like here in the US, where you always have an opportunity and a chance, and you can even go to college if you show the right knowledge. So what should I do? I was somebody who read a lot. I remember that at the time there was a little public library, and I had to bring several times when I was growing up, I had to bring my father to the library. He had to show up himself and certify with his signature that he was okay that I would read books that were for grown-ups, because I had already read everything that was for my age group, and they just didn't have anything new anymore. So he came with me a few times and signed that it would be okay that I continue reading. So I fled into reading. And then a good thing happened for me, not so easy for my father. He lost his job, and we moved to Vienna. And that was liberating in one sense, because it was a bigger town, and I thought that would somehow give me more space and more opportunities. I found a kind of academy that gave me a 2.5-year program to be like an administrator. It was the time in the late 60s that the European Union started to form, and since my father was a very political person, and at the dinner table everything we talked about was politics and history and literature and so forth, I was interested somehow to get out of little Austria. So I found this academy that miraculously didn't require a baccalaureate. And I went there and did that academy for 2.5 years, had all, here it would be A's, in Austria it was 1, yeah. And in psychology, in the languages, in economy, and whatever. But you also needed to type. And those were these huge, big mechanic typewriters. And I failed that test, and I failed it 3 times. So I never got my degree, because I didn't type fast enough and I didn't type correct enough. So then I gave up. So that was it. I had it with official institutional schools, and I realized I wanted to look for a job, and I wanted to look for a job that interested me. So what I learned from my father, who, by the way, did a fabulous thing when we were children, when nobody else in Austria still did it. He would pack us in a tiny little car, my mother, my brother, and I, and we would go just out to Europe somewhere. We didn't even know exactly where we were going. We would go to France, we would go to Sweden, we would go to Holland, whatever. And on the road, he would always know where the best churches were, where the best restaurants were, where the best ice cream was, where the best museums were with the most interesting paintings. And we did this, so that somehow opened my dimensions in terms of thinking also towards the outer world a bit. And so when I had to, I was, I think, what was it when that had failed, like 21 years old, yeah. I was 21 and needed to work. So what does one do with no credentials at all? One starts like an intern somewhere. So I was interested at the time. I thought I wanted to maybe go into journalism, and so I wrote letters to all the newspapers that were politically somehow acceptable, and to the Austrian radio and TV, and said, I'm 21 and I'm interested, and would you take me as an intern? And strangely, as luck so has it, the director of the Austrian radio and TV news needed somebody. Actually, he invited me for an interview, said no, sorry, and then I came. He called me back, and so for 6 years, first for 2 years in Vienna, and then for another 6 years actually, I worked for the Austrian radio and TV, first in Vienna and then in Rome, Italy. So I learned Italian. I was far away from Austria, not geographically, but in other sense. And what I started to learn is I found myself also, my mother had always been active in doing social work. So in hindsight, I realized that I started a kind of social service for that what were Holocaust refugees, people from Austria and from Germany who had landed in Rome, and where nobody really took care of them. They were not recognized as such at the time. It was still in the mid-70s. Many of them didn't get any reparations or any pension money or whatever. So I started working with the embassy and the consulate, and there was a group of about 30 people that I had on my list and that I visited regularly. And somehow, without knowing, I think I started to do oral history with them, because I asked them about their life stories and I listened to them. And unfortunately, I didn't record what they were saying, but I listened to their stories and learned so much from them. And then after 6 years, I realized that I was pushing 30. I knew that I couldn't continue there where I was, because there was just no advancing in my work. I worked with the correspondent. We were only 2 people in Rome. And I had experienced times like 1978, that was the year of the 3 popes, so I had 2 funerals and two elections of a pope to help report about. I was in 78 was also the year where the prime minister was captured, Aldo Moro, and was kidnapped for 8 weeks and then found dead. So for about 6 weeks I hardly ever left the building in which our office was, and also my somewhere up my apartment was, because we would work around the clock to report about that. And so when I was 30, I decided I had to make a change, went back to Austria and got hired by an international social service agency that takes care of street kids, children and youth that have lost their parents or are in need of being retrained into new jobs. And since I had all this Italian experience, they sent me to Italy, all over Italy for several years, to identify in the most remote little places, to identify needs of re-education. So I would go to the local judge, I would go to the local social worker, I would go to the teacher and whoever, and the mayor, and identify projects that then would be funded by the organization that sent me down. And that gave me an extra component, A, in managing big projects, and B, also to again look behind the curtain, as my father had taught me, because I was not looking for the private school, so I was not looking for the rich parts of a town or a city. I was going really there where the needs were, and listened or tried to listen and to understand how best to help, and then make a suggestion to the directors of the organization. So there were about 50 projects all over southern Italy, northern Italy, left and right. And while I was doing this, and I think I have to speed up if I want to tell you everything, I came across my husband, my later husband, because one project, the project for women battered, there was a first house in Italy, in Milan, for battered women and children that was initiated in the early 80s. nobody at the time in Italy. I mean, Italy 30 years ago was still, at least on the surface for everybody, the miracle place where everybody loves children and where it's paradise for children, which in many ways it is. But I think there was just still a lack of sophistication to, again, look behind the curtains and to see that child abuse and that the abuse of women is something that unfortunately happens in every society. So a person who became my mother-in-law, with her own initiative, had started this house, and I heard about it and that they needed further funding, and so I started working with her. And as I was doing this, I happened to run into her son a few months later as I was visiting again, and he is a painter, and he at the time lived here in New York. So half a year later I found myself in New York, continued to do from afar the social service projects in Italy, but found here a family with 2 teenage kids in the household, and my husband, and very soon my own daughter, and found myself in the New York art world of the time, in the midst of Soho. Had all these people that I had no clue who they were, but they came to dinner, and and slowly I started to understand that many of them at least had important shows all around Soho at the time. And I was incredibly busy and enjoyed to be in New York, not so much enjoying being far away from Europe. I somehow missed my European origins, but was quite happy with my life. And then about almost 9 years into my marriage, or 10, my marriage was over overnight, as it sometimes can happen. And my stepchildren at the time were already out and about in college or independent, and my daughter was 8 or 9. And I found myself in a sublet somewhere in the Lower East Side, and tried to figure out what would come next, because just to make things even more complicated, it wasn't only that my marriage was over, but also my work with the Italian projects had to come to an end, because we had spent the money. So either go back to Europe or stay, and I decided to stay because of my daughter, who wanted to be close to her father, which is her good right. And I think I did the right decision in staying here. But I had somehow cut all my ties back to Europe and need to understand what next to do. And since I came from journalism, I can't throw away magazines or newspapers before at least I have looked into them. And now I'm incredibly grateful that we all start reading on the internet, because like that I don't need to read everything anymore. So, but at that time, it's now almost, 15 years ago, I was depressed. I had no idea what would come next. I had no job. And there was this pile of newspapers that I hadn't looked at, and New York Times, and before throwing them out into recycling, I opened one after the other, just even if it's 2 weeks old, just to go through. And suddenly I still remember it was on the right side of the newspaper, a big article, Steven Spielberg starting a project to interview Holocaust survivors, and that they are going to open an office here in New York, and that they are going to interview 2,500 at least people, and that people who are survivors should call a certain number. So I was fascinated and intrigued, because also as I had left Europe, it was still totally bare, or mostly bare, of any kind of historic literature about that time. That only started after 85, and I left in 84. And I found a wealth of books here in New York that I started to gobble up, as I tend to gobble up books. And so when I saw this, I figured, okay, they are looking to interview 2,500 people. Maybe they are in need of interviewers. And I mean, I knew I came from journalism, so at least it was worth a try. So I called the number and I said, hey, you hear my accent, it's no doubt, it's an Austrian accent, I will never lose it. You don't see me, but I'm blonde and I'm definitely not Jewish, but this is also my story. So if you need interviewers, I would really be interested in being part. And yeah, it's as it so sometimes happens when you just have the guts to go for something. It happened, and I became part of that group. And that was really my initiation into oral history, because suddenly everything came together. Everything came together personally, because as I was interviewing hundreds of people and listening to hundreds of stories, not that the specific questions that I have would all be answered, but I think I came as close as I could. Because I also have to say that my father, who I would have interviewed had I had understood that he would die so early, he died when I was only 28 years old. So I can't go back to my father and ask him stories. I can still go back to my mother, who is 94, but I cannot go back to my father. And so with the Spielberg project, it also, as it was such a big project, and what is so wonderful about these big projects, and I'm so glad that Sadie is here, because she's doing something in a similar way on a small, Sadie from the Brooklyn Historical Society. Oral history projects, the way how I love them, are a team effort, a group thing, where we as the interviewers learn incredibly much, not only from the narrators but also from each other as we are going along. And what also started happening with the Shoah project, which I think before had not been thought through that well because it evolved, is not only did we teach each other and help each other in the research for the interviews, in the preparation for the interviews, but what was most important was the support afterwards. So what for example I can share with you is we had once a 1 week intensive up in the Catskills, because like some of you may know, the Jewish immigrants and Holocaust survivors until very recently, and some still do, would all go up to the Catskills in the summer and be on vacation there with their children and with their grandchildren. And oftentimes in hotels where hundreds and hundreds of these families would come together. So the Shoah Foundation decided that we would do a week of intensive interviewing there. So imagine a Holocaust interview is something that really drains you. And we committed to 1 week and 2 interviews a day. So it was really so intense, because each of us had sometime, somewhere, a moment where we broke down. We were so high on adrenaline and on it was like these incredibly intense experiences. So we really needed each other to decompress afterwards. We needed each other to go for walks. We needed each other to make silly jokes. We needed each other to sing songs. We needed each other also to hug and to not be alone, because something like that you cannot do on your own. And that these intensive days also had as a result, or maybe it wasn't just these days, but we formed support groups for each other. Because especially when it is about stories of horror, of terror, of genocide, of all the most unimaginable things. We take these things in, but we also need to somehow get rid of them afterwards. And I cannot go home to a loved one in my family and tell them about it, because that wouldn't be appropriate, nor would they really want to hear it. I think that's what then in such an instance the group of support is. So I would really encourage all of you, when you do an intense project in the future about a topic that's really a complex one, then confide with each other, form groups with each other, support each other, and help each other, because that will really bring you to also in the quality of what you are doing on a very different level. Something, because we said I would also say anecdotes, and you were asking me before about the memory and how our memory changes. One thing came to my mind as I was preparing for this. In the course of my Holocaust interviews, there were several people, obviously, who would talk about being transported or being sent to camps and coming through my hometown. Because especially the Hungarians, when who were the last ones to be sent to concentration camps in 43, 44, they would need to travel west, and the main route was through my hometown, Linz. So I remember to have interviewed a beautiful woman, a Hungarian woman who was a child when that happened to her. She was on such a train. And she talked about being, that they were thinking, because they were among the rich Hungarians who the Nazis took a lot of money from them, pretending that if they gave them all their estate and all their money and everything that they had, they would form this train, and the train would bring them down south to Italy and from there to Palestine, which was a complete lie. They took the money, and all these rich Hungarian families boarded the train and went west. So the woman described that, and the woman described that they stopped in Linz. And I used this interview often to speak about things. And in my memory, she had talked about actually really the train stations and the guards being up on a balcony that I knew so well in this big hall, because that was my childhood train station. I knew it. So I could really visualize how that must have been. And then about half a year later or so, there was an oral history conference down in Durham, and somebody from the Shoah Foundation called me and asked me to be part of a panel and to use one interview as an example and to talk about it. And this interview, since it touched so much my own history, I felt was the one that I wanted to talk about. And I asked them to send me the tape, and I really wanted to use this segment with the train station, as she was describing the SS being up on the balcony and so forth. And I listened to it, and I listened to it, and I can't find it. It wasn't in there. It was just in my mind. She talked about coming through Linz, and she talked about being out there and then being transported further. But she didn't describe the train station. But since the train station was so much in me, I integrated it and made it part of the story. And then the evidence of... So that was one of my very first big lessons in also not trusting my own memories, to understand that every day I'm constructing who I am. And every day, if you ask me tomorrow, there will be something different than that what I tell you today. So that was a really, really interesting experience. But it was still a good interview, and it was about my hometown to a degree, but just not about that what I remember. And after having done many Shoah interviews for the Spielberg Foundation, by the way, they also had a very started a system that I also encourage you, if you ever run a larger project, to do. They every other interview, there was a person assigned to me in California at the Shoah Foundation who would look at my interviews, probably not each and every one in its entirety, and then every few weeks she would call me and we would have a kind of coaching session. And she would call me and we would talk about certain aspects of the interview that went especially well or went not so well, or and this was so, I learned so much from her. And this Jessica Wiederhorn, she became a real friend, because it was amazing what I learned from her. And it's so useful, so I encourage you to integrate that in your projects if you do. And then the University of Vienna asked me to become the regional project director for the Mauthausen Memorial History Project, and that is about the Mauthausen concentration camp, which is a concentration camp that's about 5 miles outside of Linz, which is also something that I somehow grew up with in the neighborhood of. And we interviewed about 110 Holocaust survivors here in the US, which for me was fabulous, because it gave me, I don't know how many I did, we were 4 interviewers, and we divided the country in different areas and would go out there and interview people. And it gave me, for the first time, I didn't have that opportunity yet, to see the United States or to see certain cities. I had always, I'm always going back to Austria, to my family of origin, or to my Italian family, but I didn't have an opportunity to see the US, and that was a fabulous way also to see the differences in this beautiful country. Again, this was I was as well an interviewer as well the project director for the US, and we were 4 people interviewing, and when that ended, that was almost the moment that I had described in our discussion before, where I was at the end of my strength and energy to do this as an independent person, meaning not affiliated to a university or a historical society or whatever, because I would have had already months and months and months before the project ended, had started to write grants for a next project, and I didn't have any ideas. I was just burned out, and so I was in the process probably of thinking what might come next, and now I'm not sure of the sequence. Then came September 11, and Mary Marshall called. I had just finished the summer institute, and we started interviewing, and that again was a fabulous lesson, and I'm so grateful that she designed it the way she did, because we did a first interview with the people we ourselves identified, because the project obviously wasn't planned. September 11 happened. We could identify the group of people we wanted to interview. And since I had lived down in Soho and Tribeca, I mostly interviewed women who were mothers and self-employed like I was. That was most of them, but not everyone. Suddenly what surfaced was the wonderful distance between the interviews. We had a first interview immediately in the first 3 months after the event, and then we went back about a year or a year and a half later. And again, similar things happened as happened with this woman in the, or the story of the woman in the station. I had remembered certain events that somebody told me about really differently than when I actually got them on paper in the transcript. And then when I went to interview them, a third version of the same memories would surface. So there was the first immediate memory right after the event. Then a year later, the collective memory had set in. We all had seen certain images a zillion of times. We had heard certain stories a zillion of times. We integrated certain parts. And then we re-interviewed people a year or so later, and that gave incredibly fascinating variances that I would love to go back to one day and look into a little closer. What I saw as a pattern emerge, and also again, like all life histories that you just listen to, this one taught me the sense of home, how we all in our need to have a sense of home. And even if that place that for us signifies home is at the moment the most dangerous one, we still want to go back to that. And why am I saying that? I interviewed two groups of women. One group were the women north of the towers who lived in Tribeca or in Soho, and many of them had their home businesses at home. And what they did when the towers were hit, they started running towards the event. They started running to the schools to help save the children. They started running down there to see if they could be of any kind of help. It was their neighborhood. And the police had somehow really to beat them and really force them out of the area as the day progressed. And they all had to stay in shelters or in hotels or with friends for a few days. But what did they do? Secretly, because they knew all the little roads and they knew how to go around the barriers, or they knew how to talk with an officer who would not first want to let them through. They would talk them into saying, well, my cat needs food. I need to go home. So they would sneak back home to be home, because their home, their apartment was the place where they felt safe, even after the terrible events of the September 11. And what happened though with the women that I interviewed south of the towers, or had been south of the towers? Those were not resident down there. Those were women who were commuters. Mothers, all of them. They lived in Staten Island, they lived in New Jersey, they lived somewhere in Westchester. They all worked in the financial district. Some worked at the Museum of Jewish Heritage at those offices. And as most commuters do, as those of you who are from New York may have experienced yourselves, people take the train, come to work. All they might know is maybe the next deli a block away where they get their salad or sandwich for lunch, but they don't venture out to walk around and to look, because all they need to do, especially if they're young mothers, as soon as it's 5 o'clock, they take their bag, they run to the subway and they go home. So what happened on September 11 in the late morning? They were in the southern, very southern tip of the island. The towers fell. The subways didn't work. There was this huge cloud of dust that came towards them. Many of them thought they would choke because there was so much dust in the air. And they didn't know their surroundings. They had no idea where to go. They were trapped. But their instinct told them to go home to their children. So these stories were incredibly powerful, because these women really, it took some of them a day or two to get home and to figure out, either by water or maybe by finding through a friend the Brooklyn Bridge, or even to queue up in front of one of the public phones that were there. The cell phones didn't work, to give news to the families that the mothers were still alive. So these were really, really powerful stories to compare, to show how, and that was for me the topic, how important home, or feeling safe at home, how important that is. Yeah. And then after that I had another project that I'm still working on. That's the Henry Nouwen project. Henry Nouwen was, some of you may have looked him up. He has been dead now for 20 years, I should know. He was a Dutch priest. He was gay, openly gay. He was a Roman Catholic priest. And he, probably because of where he came from, he was a very unusual priest who he would work and talk with Nobel Prize winners and speak at Harvard or teach at Harvard and Yale and Notre Dame, as much as he would work with people with disabilities, or people who of any shapes and sizes. And the project that I helped to create, and where I trained the interviewers and we shaped how we would go about it, was on the occasion of an anniversary of his sudden death. He died in his 60s, to show what an unusual person he was, in what unusual ways he had touched the lives of such a wide range of people. Because his home in his last 10 years was in a community with severely, severely disabled people. And he was taking care of one of these. This is a community where so-called able-bodied or healthy people live with so-called severely disabled people. And so we identified both the people who he influenced and who influenced him intellectually all over the world, be it in Europe, be it in the US. And we talked and tried to find also ways how to interview these people who, some of them have really a hard time to articulate a sentence, and can articulate these sentences many times with the help of an assistant. And so this was a very, very beautiful project, and still is, and I'm grateful I could be part of that one. And after that, then, as I mentioned in the hour before, I took now for 7 years a day job that gave me a paycheck and health insurance, and now I'm freelancing again. And I'm doing oral history projects, like I'm so happy to be part of the one that Sadie is conducting at the Brooklyn Historical Society about mixed heritage. And I also work for private clients. People call me, and I'm going to Europe now to interview 3 different people where somebody hires me to interview their old aunt or their grandfather, and to somehow then either make a nice audio story out of it, or a video, or whatever their budget allows. Yeah, and that's my journey ongoing, I hope.
Anyone have any questions?
Talk about how you market yourself a little bit for the private clients. How do they find you? And